and inviting me to share. So my name is Christine Muneza. I'm married to Reverend Steve Muneza, and that's not the only hat I have, but that's how some of you may know of me. So my background is in teaching, and I was a teacher in Burundi, East Africa, and I came to Durham to study intercultural communication and education. Can I confirm you can hear me because my connection's not good? Okay, thank you. So I apologize for that. So sorry, I've gone.
If we find that Christine really has struggles in the next couple of minutes to get connected and be able to speak, then I'm going to pull Mark in and ask Mark to jump the queue and do his bit while Christine tries to find her best place in the house to stand with her computer over her head. Is that Christine back, Deborah? Right. Okay. I think what we'll do is we'll give let's give Christine some time. We'll message her if she comes in and let her know. Mark, would you mind if we just went to you?
Absolutely. If we could, hello, lovely to meet you, by the way. My name is Mark. I'm in Bristol Diocese. And yeah, and it'd be great if I could just maybe share screen.
Okay. Yep, of course.
All right. So before I introduce myself, I just want to, just say how encouraging it is to see so many of you wanting to engage with issues of racism. It isn't the easiest thing to do. It can be very uncomfortable at times. So yeah, I just want to commend each one of you for being here tonight, subjecting yourself to me for the next 25 minutes or so. I feel like a lion in a den of Daniels because you're so lovely. My name's Mark. I'm assistant curate in Bristol. I'm British Chinese, but you might not necessarily glean that from my name. Let me explain. See, when my grandfather came to the UK in the 1920s, and I'm just going to see if I can get this to work. In the 1920s, he was asked by immigration what his name is. And in traditional Chinese fashion, he introduced himself by his family name first. So, Kathleen, you would say, my name is Kirby Kathleen. So he introduced himself as Yun Nam. And so what happened was his given name from that day forward became my family name. So we became known as the Kirbys, so to speak, or the Nams. I open with that story because it highlights that for many immigrant families, identity can be a real issue from the start. And when I was growing up in the UK, I wasn't sure how to reconcile my British identity with my Chinese one. And this has been the lens through which I view and engage the world. It's a lens of constant tensions. And I think it's fair to say that when we engage with issues of race and justice, we're choosing to enter into a space of tension. And that's okay. Now, rather than me sharing whatever comes to mind, I'm going to center my reflections tonight around a passage of scripture. And this is going to provide us with a roadmap. So whilst I will be taking a few little tangents here and there, I'm going to be coming back to the passage just to move us on. And the passage I've chosen is Matthew 2, 1-12, the Magi from the East. I can't see if this is... Oh, I'm having problems with PowerPoint tonight, aren't I? The Magi from the East. Let me just see if I can get this to work. Now, most of us are familiar with the story. We use it every year when we have a nativity play, and it's a perennial Epiphany reading. But see, when I was a child, I was always cast as one of the wise men. And I found this really difficult. Why was I only... struggling here with the PowerPoint. Why was I always cast as a wise man, never an angel or a shepherd or even Joseph? And remember, as a little boy, this passage wasn't necessarily good news. It reminded me that I'm different, stereotyped. I lay my gifts down at the manger, and then I'm expected to melt away. Pigeonholed, typecast, these are all words that kind of characterize my experience actually growing up in the UK and in the church as a minority. And that occurred as I grew up when I went to work. If you're East Asian, you work hard, you don't cause trouble, keep your head down and stay in the background. But as I've learned to embrace both sides of my British and Chinese identity, or rather, since I've allowed Jesus to heal my fractured identity, my reading of the Bible, and this passage in particular, has been transformed. So what I want us to do is to have a look at it together and see how it enriches all of our understandings as we approach the issues of race. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. Now, Matthew presents this passage as a 3-act tragedy: search, disillusionment, and discovery. And within that scheme, we have some pithy theological statements that I think will have contemporary relevance for us as we approach race. Now, last month, the British government has started a scheme where people who were British citizens pre-97 are able to come over with a BNO passport, a British national overseas. And we're expecting around 300,000 people to apply for that. And let me just, can you see this on the screen? Around 130,000 are set to arrive in 2021. And we're expecting around 8,000 people have arrived already since July under a Leave Outside the Rules scheme. And the reason I'm sharing with you is because this is relevant to us, because this is the biggest organised migration from outside Europe since Windrush. And you don't need me to repeat how badly the government and the church have handled that. And the fact of the matter is that the face of the UK is set to change significantly in the years ahead. And this will be the context into which you and I, even down in Bristol, will be ministering in. And we can't really afford to mess it up as we have in the past. So yeah, I think it's important for us as church leaders to understand the East Asian experience, lest we commit the sins of the past. But as I said, we're going to be looking at Matthew. And I said that there were 3 kind of segments, which were search, disillusionment, and discovery. And let's go with Act 1, just to help guide our thoughts. So as soon as the Magi are introduced, we read that they are searching. Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews, they ask. So the first thing we know is that a light or a star has appeared in the east. So when we think about sharing the gospel with people from other parts of the world, like those from Hong Kong, we shouldn't assume that they're ignorant. And yet when you look back at a lot of missional practice, we have been very condescending of foreign traditions and philosophies. And I believe in your first session, Eileen shared with you how dismissive and quite frankly disrespectful people have been of her culture and insights. And what we need to understand is that in the East, culture and religion are a lot more intertwined than they are in the UK. You see, in our society, we have a very clear secular and religious divide. And in many ways, this reflects the church's inability to remain relevant. But in places like East Asia, religion and culture are closely related. So if you dismiss someone's religious beliefs or worldviews, you're also dismissing their culture and therefore them as a person. So in some ways, it can be quite racist. So that's something to bear in mind and to avoid. Now notice it's not just any light or star that they're following, but it says his star. Now this is significant because Matthew is demonstrating that Christ's coming was revealed in the East even before those in Jerusalem had heard about it. Isn't that interesting? You see, this light is a sacramental pointer to a mystery that entices the Eastern sages, to a deeper search. So we're not just content with the light, they're looking for its source. And as I've said, when engaging with other people of other faiths, we shouldn't be so quick to write off all that they have discerned. Perhaps there is some real wisdom or aspects of truth in their beliefs and cultures. Growing up, and I showed a picture of me as a little boy at the beginning, I was ashamed of my culture. I was bullied a lot because of it, and so I hid it. So practically, can we think of ways that, our churches can celebrate the differences, maybe particular feasts or festivals that are meaningful to other cultures? And later on, I'll paste a link into the chat of something I've just written for Preach Magazine that speaks directly into this. But okay, let's move quickly on to Matthew's second act. And he brings a whole drama to a peak of irony, contrasting the seriousness of the Asian mages with the complacency of God's priests in Jerusalem. And when you examine the exchange between the Magi, and Herod, it becomes clear that the light shining in the east was not seen by the city on the hill. And we see that Herod calls together all of the chief priests and teachers of the law to ask them where the Messiah was to be born. So even though they were aware of the prophecies, they haven't seen the star. And that's why Herod asks the Magi, to go and search carefully for the child. So what's interesting is that it's from the Eastern sages that Jerusalem hears the good news for the first time. It's through them that God reveals to God's own people, and we are God's people, in Jerusalem, that the divine is present in Christ. It is the foreigner's inquiry that provokes the priests to read the scripture for further insight. So they bring the good news. And yet, even when presented with the good news, we read, that King Herod and all of those with him were disturbed. Now, sometimes when I bring up East Asian theology, people get agitated really quickly, and they become disturbed. Maybe for some of you, the thought of engaging with people from other religions is daunting, or perhaps you might think interreligious dialogue, is not really any point to it. Maybe it disturbs you. But remember, at this point in the narrative, Jerusalem represents the institutional center of God's people. So how disturbed will our institution and our churches be when Cantonese-speaking families from Hong Kong turn up on our doorsteps? Are we going to ask them to melt away into the background too, or are we going to welcome and embrace them? I'm just going to stop there. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this going all right? Okay, because what I want to do now is I'm going to take a little... can you see the PowerPoint again? Can someone make a noise?
Yep, we can see it.
What I'm going to do is take a little interval before we move into our third act. And I want to pause and take maybe like a little deviation, so to speak. And this relates to some of what I believe Christine will share about in terms of unconscious bias. I was going to go after Christine and obviously try and respond to it, but I know she's covering unconscious bias. And I want to talk about the formative powers of whiteness on the East Asian experience. And I'll unpack this a little bit for us because I do believe it's important. So there's a theologian called Willie James Jennings who's written this book, and it has a lot of traction in the academy. And he argues that our imaginations have become diseased, okay? Which is why there's so much enmity, injustice, and racism. And he says the future requires an intense consideration of the formative power of whiteness. As I've shown in the text, whiteness must be analysed, not simply as substantiation of European hegemonic gestures, but more precisely in its identity facilitating characteristics. Notice that word, identity facilitating or forming. Its judgment constituting features and its global deployment of embodied visions of the true, the good and beautiful. So Jennings gets right to the point here, and I think it's helpful for us. Our white normative culture, now I appreciate some of us may not be convinced that this is a thing, so we might call it a white theology, a white worldview, a white privilege, whatever you are comfortable calling it. It has a profound impact on how other people groups perceive themselves, whether they're black, brown, or in my case, East Asian. And whiteness dictates visions of what is true, good, and beautiful. So we need to be mindful of the formative power of whiteness that is prevalent in our society and churches, even if it's not initially obvious to us. And as I said, Christine's going to be talking about, those unconscious levels. A couple of months ago, an ordained lay minister in my church led a service using a children's book. And in it was the line, the bear chose Lucy, this is the story, because she was the prettiest little girl. She had golden blonde hair and bright blue eyes, and so on. Now, I thank God that my kids weren't there to listen to that, because totally unawares, this lay minister allowed white norms to dictate what is desirable to these young children and could have caused some real damage. So there was no malice intended, but it was ignorant all the same. So basically what I want us to try and understand is how the formative power of whiteness, again, we're talking about unconscious bias, impacts the psyche of people who have a different color, who are from different places, right, or don't have white skin. And again, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but to do that, I'm going to employ the aid of speculative fiction, or sci-fi. So I want us to have a little bit of fun. I want to start with a sci-fi character called Dr. Fu Manchu, and some of you may be old enough to remember him. He was created by a British author, so yay, UK, called Sax Rohmer. He actually first appeared in 1912. And he is perhaps one of the earliest and most potent representations of a Chinese person in the British public consciousness. So Fu Manchu is a figure of unnatural, unknowable peril who must be kept from acquiring knowledge, lest it be used against the Western subject. So can you pick up the fear here? And in one episode, Dr. Fu Manchu plots to strengthen China, and think about our current political situation, by kidnapping European engineers, suggesting the Orient's lack of technological prowess and desire for Western technology. And as an aside, he also desires Western women. And that's a theme that happens all the way through the 20th century. Throughout, this century, or last century, speculative visions of East Asians, and I want to stress the future orientatedness of this, okay? Because often as Christians, we talk about the eschatological vision of the kingdom coming, the here but not quite yet. So this is future orientated. We have Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon. Now he hails from the planet Mongo. Don't get me started with that name. But he again is an evil Chinese despot, hell-bent on stealing everything from our Western hero, including his female companion. And along with Ming, notice on the left, we have his oriental daughter called Aura, an overly sexualized seductress who will snaffle your husband or partner if you're not careful. But thankfully, she is reformed by her love for Flash Gordon, our white protagonist, of course she is. And all of a sudden, it's okay for her to be sexually objectified, so long as it's for the white man's pleasure. We have the Wrath of Khan in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek universe, the Mandarin in Iron Man 3, who's actually a mashup of Western anxieties of the Middle East and East Asians throughout the 20th century.
This
Sorry.
man is talking.
I'm talking. Off you go. Sorry, that was...
We welcome everybody, Mark. That's absolutely fine.
That was Jamie. But what I'm trying to stress using sci-fi as a bit of fun, but a serious thing, is that East Asians are to be feared because they take from us. And they're ultimately othered. And this happens across not just TV, but history, art, literature, even computer games. But what I want to show you is that all visions, imaginations, and remember Jennings mentioned the diseased imagination.
I think it was just while we are waiting for Mark to return, if you have a pen by your hand, the Guardian newspapers wrote quite in-depthly on an unconscious bias series. So you might want to look that up because it says quite a bit in terms of research around identity. And it gave examples, for example, of people who are of color being seen more of a threat. But there was actually research done into that. So the Guardian newspaper unconscious bias series, if you've got a pen, take a note of that and have a read of those articles. Back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just get this up and running again. So really, what I'm trying to say is that speculative, secular visions of the future see East Asians as a threat. And again, if you think about what's happening right now in our society and the rise in hate crime, that's not a surprise. You look at Blade Runner, and I want you to see what common themes you can see here. You got Blade Runner, you've got Cloud Atlas. These are all visions of the future. You've got Total Recall, The Fifth Element. They all place heavy emphasis on the use of East Asian aesthetics and symbols, neon signs with Japanese and Chinese lettering. And take a look at this recently launched BBC Sound series. I can see the sign, I can read it, but why is it there? And where are all the East Asian characters? There are none in the list. The question is, what has led the Western imagination to project and even fetishize East Asians in the future this way? Well, this genre is called cyberpunk, and it finds its origins in Western anxieties about the East that go all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, when Japanese companies were beginning to take a foothold in the automobile and technological industry. For the longest time, the West has dominated the global scene, but slowly countries like Japan, Korea, and China have started catching up, innovating and even surpassing the West. And this is the point. Western visions of the future, as expressed in movies and literature, paint a bleak, dark, and dystopian landscape where East Asians have taken over. Can you see that now? And what happens if we let East Asians take over our country? That's the question they're asking. When powers like the UK, France, and Netherlands were facing an end to their global spanning empires, two specific fears emerged that fueled this imagination. Number one, they feared they'd be outpaced in technological and political clout. And number two, they feared the growing influence of Chinese immigrants, and I'm a child of immigrants, who had originally been exploited for cheap labor and were now settling in the West. And let's consider all of this in light of the 300,000 Hong Kongers who are expected to settle here. What fears might be triggered in the Western imagination and media, as we're already seeing, and what effect will this have on the East and Southeast Asian communities? And remember, these communities could very well be in your parish. I'll give you the answer. It's racism. In sci-fi literature, again, you'll notice that humanity comes together and normally they unite and they have a common language. It's basically American English. But there's always one ethnicity who are not part of common humanity, who still speak a broken English and wear national dress. And it's always the East Asians. There's wonderful surveys of this. They are perpetually othered. Now, I'm part of a team who run a charity called CARG. It stands for COVID Anti-Racism Group. We're non-political, so one of the things we do is gather data. And the number of hate crimes, so recorded acts of violence against East and Southeast Asians, has gone up by 300%. This is the most significant rise against any particular group in the UK since the pandemic began. And Moonshot, who monitor online content, have recorded a 900% increase in racist and violent hashtags against Chinese and East Asians. And a poll by the YouGov, so the government, has revealed that 76% of Chinese have been a victim of racial slurs, including myself, my family, and children, compared with 64% of all other BAME respondents. And all of these figures are expected to, and we're actually already seeing them rise. So when we explore the Western imagination of the future, Asian communities are projected as foreign and the other, resting outside of some typical white norm. And, movies, games, literature, our cultural markers teach us to view East Asians as, perpetual foreigners. And if that's the case, and it is, it shouldn't be a surprise that as more settle in the UK, the more resentment and fear will be exposed. Now, notice I said that it will be exposed. I didn't say more fear and resentment will be created. And this is a crucial difference for you, again, particularly if you're speaking from a public platform, because the former reveals the racist or unconscious bias already present in the diseased mind, as Jennings puts it. The latter suggests that immigrants moving here are responsible for creating the resentment, and therefore that they are the source of the problem. Can you appreciate the subtle difference? But it's important. We have to watch our language. And as ministers and leaders, we have to point people to examine the state of their own hearts and minds instead of deflecting attention to the migrants or refugees as if it's their fault. And again, this might be a really useful reflection if you're seeking to look at the role discipleship has to play in forming attitudes and transforming hearts. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but I felt it was important. Now, moving on to our final act in Matthew's narrative. Just remember, we're going through this narrative, this story, and it's discovery. We've had search, we've had disillusionment, and now we have discovery. So after leaving Herod, they follow the star and eventually arrive at the house. Now let's pause for a moment. Matthew describes it here as a house. Now we know that Joseph was a carpenter. So their long journey in pursuit of a source of light ends up in a labourer's hut. It's in a rural home. So coming at it from an East Asian perspective, Christ is found seated on the knees of a peasant woman, a worker's wife. He's come to be with the underprivileged and the working class. And this is a compelling picture for us in how we choose to engage with the marginalized, with the poor. And then the final verse, they return home eastward with the good news, but note, and this is really important, the same providence that guided them to the Saviour has them bypassing Jerusalem, the institutional centre of God's people, because he warns them in a dream not to go that way. And what's interesting in Matthew's description is that the gospel still spreads without having to go through the leaders of God's people. You see, the institution is not indispensable. And I think this is a warning for us in the church. We can focus on our own concerns, plans, and strategies. But if we don't love our neighbour, reach out to the marginalised, or welcome the stranger, we might, or even we will, miss out on the blessings that God has in store for us. So again, we're seeing a rise in racist attacks and violence against East Asians coming. And I would say as a church, we need to be aware of that so we can be proactively welcoming and embracing them. I mentioned at the start that this influx of migrants from Hong Kong is being held as comparable with the Windrush in terms of numbers. And we are still dealing with the fallout and the hurt done to those who came over in that migration. We can't afford to repeat the same mistakes. And so when I read this passage with renewed eyes and new lenses, I no longer feel like I did as a young boy growing up in the UK. I no longer feel like I have to hide my light. I no longer feel like I have nothing to offer. I see myself differently now. No longer like a bird in a cage. I can see the good news. As a British-born Chinese Christian, I have much to offer the body of Christ. And in fact, all children of the diaspora do. Black, white, brown, Asian. We're all part of one family, the church. And we are conformed to the image of Christ when we welcome one another. So let our reading, our understanding, and our teaching of the Bible be good news to all those who hear it. And let it inform the way that we welcome and show hospitality. So what I've tried to do using that scripture as a roadmap is draw out maybe some reflections from that scripture about how to welcome the stranger. But then I took a tangent looking at this idea of imagination. What is your imagination? What is our imagination as we think of the other? Is it diseased? Are they perpetually othered? Or do we have another narrative? And of course, there's plenty of scriptures that paint a beautiful picture, an alternative imagination that we have that we know is of the kingdom. Now I'll pause there because I realized from what you said, Karenza, at the start, that some of the feedback has been for some more practical suggestions and things. And maybe I'll hold them until after Christine shares, if that's all right.
No, that's absolutely fabulous. I think we should pause anyway, because I think we should reflect on some of the things that you've actually said. And let's try and do that, because it was a whirlwind tour of a whole range of massive amounts of thinking that you've put into this. So there was a lot to take on there. Christine is trying to rejoin us, but at the moment she's struggling to do that with her IT tech. If for any reason something doesn't happen with Christine today, then we'll just end the session earlier and we'll run it with Christine separately later on. So I'm not going to panic about that. There's some complexity, and I want to get my head around this properly. There's some complexity in some of the stuff that's in the comments. And I think what we should do is kind of give you the opportunity to reflect on some of that complexity directly. So from what I understand from what you're saying, and let's go from the back to the front, is that in the created world, not everything is equal. Someone in the comments has mentioned, Sri's mentioned original sin. So all people are tainted by original sin in the Christian understanding. And so no one is perfect. We're going to get this wrong. But at the same time, we are propagating consciously or unconsciously stuff that actually makes the situation that's not good equally bad all the time, or actually worse for people to come. So you're challenging us to say the body of Christ should be better. The body of Christ should be looking at its original sinness and move forward from that. Is that right?
Yeah, kind of. And I mentioned at the start, when we have these discussions, we're entering a space of tension. And I've been reflecting on the creed and, that line, "We're the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church." Now let's break those down really quickly. We're not actually one yet, clearly. We're certainly not completely holy because we're sinful. We're not fully Catholic in the universal sense, and we're certainly not apostolic in what we're doing. So all of these things we haven't fulfilled yet. They're aspirations. And what I would say in response to that reflection, Karenza, is I would add a fifth, which is we're the one holy apostolic Catholic and intention church. And it's right, absolutely right, that we recognize that. Absolutely. It is only through Christ that true reconciliation is possible, in 1 Colossians. But in the meantime, we are to usher in that. So yes, I think we should strive for it, but I don't think we should always beat ourselves over the head for not being there yet. It's a balance. But yeah, those are some reflections I've had recently.
I think that's really helpful. I mean, it's the first time we've actually had someone take us through a piece of scripture quite as solidly as you have done. And the scripture itself is something that we could look at, and I think we should. But before we go into that, from what you've just said, I wonder how many people see our worship as entirely aspirational. We do the worship, we walk out the door and fail, and we aspire to do better until the next time. And then we do it again, and then we do it again, and then we do it again. So there is something about accepting our brokenness and our sinfulness, but then being equally committed and intentional to move on and move through to the next stage. So you're inviting us to be aware of our cultural absorption in stuff that's deeply racist.
And I think what's interesting is, I often introduce myself like this. I'll do it to illustrate the point. Sitting before you right now speaking are 3 marks. There's not just one of me. So the first mark is public mark. This is the mark that I know, and I'm letting you know. Then there's also private mark sitting before you. Now, private mark is the mark that I know, but you don't know. I don't let you there. But there's a third mark, and this is hidden mark. Now, interestingly, this is the mark that I don't know, but I need your eyes to see. And I say this because I think we need to be bold in engaging with people who are very different from us, because it is only engaging with people who are different, maybe Chinese or Black, that they can tell us what we can't see of ourselves. It is only in coming together that we can really help each other conform more into the likeness of Christ. So, again, to encourage you, what you're doing this Lent series is incredible. I said at the beginning, it is difficult, it's uncomfortable, but I think God is shaking us up and refining us through this process.
That's really helpful. Can I ask for some clarifications from you in as much as they've come up? One of them is your reference to East Asian. Quite often Asian means something else completely, East Asian. Do you want to just clarify for us what that is? Because that, from my understanding, that's already a completely bizarrely colonial way of describing people. So I think it's interesting that it's a self-identification. I understand why you might do it, but just tell us something about East Asian, will you, just for me?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to work with the terms that are kind of already out there. So I recognize the colonial overtures of it. But I think what rubs a lot of the, I say, East Asian community up the wrong way is when they feel they're lumped into a larger group that's more diverse. So to say that you're Asian, well, I'll be like, well, hang on, there's so much diversity in Asia. And so actually separating it out a bit is helpful. So you have East Asia, Southeast Asia, and other parts. I think one good way to get your head around, because we still sometimes use categories, is the way I understand East Asian is working out what the common worldview is. So I'm not really going by geography. And the common worldview would be one that is basically Confucian. And I think Eileen might have mentioned this, Confucian and Buddhist. So the countries that generally have that kind of worldview in history would be like China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea. But, it's very difficult to work out these differences, and you have to always kind of what's the word, explain it from the start. But yeah, I used East Asian to separate me from, let's say, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, because their experience of racism is very different. But what's interesting is, even though I'm keen to help people recognize the differences in the racism that different groups have, one of the common themes, though, that they have is actually the formative power of whiteness. So even though my experience is different from someone who's Black or from the Middle East, and we want to, recognize the differences and particularity, very often you find that it all comes back to how colonialism and whiteness has caused injustice.
Mm-hmm. So in sweeping the world with its whiteness, everything else becomes other. And that perspective is the dominant perspective from where we are sitting in this country, in this society, from where we are.
Yeah, and maybe if saying whiteness, is too painful, a good way to talk about it then is to talk from science, is to talk about the Enlightenment. And it was when science really came to the fore, where people start, and rationality, where people suddenly needed to index things, and categorize them. So that indexing meant that people of white skin were at the top, and then it was perhaps Chinese people, and then you found blacks basically at the bottom, is basically how it worked out. So sometimes if you're having this conversation, it's a bit easier to go into it by explaining kind of how it came out of the Enlightenment first.
That is also helpful, because sometimes it's not about colour of the skin. And sometimes when I've had people saying to me about, we've got no one in our village, we've got no one in our village, you go, have you not got a Chinese takeaway? And I go, yeah, I forgot about them. Yeah, and it's the most, it's how you perceive what racism is, how you perceive what the categories are that people might be involved in, all of that. We're welcoming back Christine with us. I do want you to address this question because I think it's really important, and I could do that, but I'm not going to. It's something about the contextualization of the British racist attitude to people from East Asian countries in relation to how the Japanese treated people during the war, the British reaction to that. Now, I'd want you to answer that rather than me doing that. So do you think there's anything in that?
Sorry, can you just clarify the question?
Okay, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Part of the problem in the 1950s was to do with the Japanese military's treatment of anyone who was not Japanese. So in the British cultural memory, there is a particular experience of the Japanese, which is being extrapolated, I would guess, or the proposal is it's being extrapolated across those of many other East Asian nations. Would you like to comment on that? Yeah,
sure. They always say that the victors of war write history. Okay, so yeah, absolutely, we have exposed the atrocities that Japanese soldiers did to humanity. But here's something I was actually going to talk about tonight, but I didn't. So it's great that you asked. But after the war, after VE Day, 140,000 Chinese or East Asian people were brought across by the British, and they thought they were going to be just kind of doing manual work, but not dangerous. But they ended up being the ones who cleared out the trenches and removing the bombs. So after VE Day, after we were all celebrating, thousands of Chinese were blown to bits, knee deep in body parts and ammunitions. And what's really sad is that when some of them complained about their work conditions, and there's records of this, they were executed by Brits who had now won the war. And what's more is that some of them, met local English lasses, I suppose, and had children, but instead of being allowed to stay, they were sent across, and I'm part of a group that are actually looking still for the parents of these children who have a Chinese father and an English mother. And what's worse is when they went back to their main part of China that they're from, the British had decided in their politics to give that part of China to the Japanese. So what happened was when they returned home, that their families had been murdered and their villages had been burnt down. And what's really interesting is that of the 150,000 war memorials in our country, some dedicated to animals like horses, there is not one memorial dedicated to the Chinese. We have to go to Belgium to pay our respects. So what I would say is the victors of war write the history. And it's only when we admit to our common sinfulness, right, that we can actually begin reconciliation and healing. But so long as, I suppose, we in the West deny our past or deny our white normative, then that's not going to happen, and we'll forever be in a position of unequal power and so forth. So that's one way I might respond to that. Now, interestingly, with the Japanese, I'm not Japanese, but I'm in the middle of actually writing a thesis on cute. So this is my topic, cuteness, the power of cuteness. And what's really interesting is after the war, the Japanese developed a persona of cuteness because it was one of the subconscious ways that they could again be welcomed back into the world's acceptance. So they've actually played on cuteness as a way to make themselves non-threatening, which is why everything from Japan is kawaii, very cute. Anyway,
Manga and all the way
I'd
of
love to share
dressing
that
and
with you one
things.
day.
Yeah, no, when you finish your thesis, we'll invite you back. That's that would be a really interesting thing to do. But it's that notion of a trauma. How does a traumatized nation respond? And I guess what the one of the interesting questions I think we haven't posed around that question about the response of the Japanese military is, in all of our conversations about people of color or Black people talking about when they come here, their experiences and what they do, we don't have people of color from Kenya or other places going, the British did this to me, they stuck pencils in my ear and they broke my eardrums, so I'm going to come here and do this to you. We don't remember the atrocities that British people have committed abroad to people and to nations and to whole cultures, and then we're offended because they get upset by our treatment of them. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, and just two things on that. You mentioned trauma, and I think, when we're working with people, who are in minorities, sometimes it's worth just bearing in mind, what trauma might this person be carrying? Why is it that perhaps it's difficult, to open up? There's in Bristol, we're holding an event to talk about vaccination, to encourage people from BAME communities to take vaccination, because obviously a lot resist it. But what I've discovered is that for a lot of the Black communities, some of them have in their living memory of their parents being test subjects of vaccinations by the British. And there's another community who were withheld from the syphilis vaccination because the British scientists want to see, well, what would actually happen if syphilis was allowed to promulgate amongst the population? And so with that understanding, I don't look at my Black brothers and sisters who are basically wary about the vaccination. I don't judge them so quickly. It's trying to learn what traumas do people of color have living in this country that we need to be aware of, rather than pointing the finger straight away and saying that, they're dangerous and all this stuff. Let's try and understand and love and usher in healing for that.
The interesting comment about the Japanese, that we have I think we've converted it to DVD now because it was on a video, but we have a very interesting film made by a researcher in Japan on how after the atomic bombs were released, the US sent hordes and hordes of medics who spent 3 years on the island, and not once did they administer treatment. They were there to observe the effects of radiation poisoning. They were never on the island, ever, to help and assist. They were simply there to run experiments to see what would happen given radiation poisoning and everything else that went with it. So we have an entire nation being experimented on by another country, and that research was used by medics all around the world and by other people interested in what happened with nuclear weapons. But that's not advertised very often, is it? No.
And it does sound bleak, but again, it is really my belief, and if it wasn't, I wouldn't be a Christian, but I really truly believe that it is through Christ that reconciliation can come. Like, I really, really do believe this. And I know that the journey is hard, and it starts with conversations like these that we're having. It starts, with being willing to humble ourselves and learn. And I think repentance is an interesting concept, but I think what I like about the Anglican tradition actually is that in our morning prayer or in our daily prayer, we repent daily, but we receive his grace and mercy daily. And it can actually part.
Good night.
But yeah, when I was part of
Good night, lovely. Say good night as well.
Part of my background is I used to be a pastor in a non-denominational church, a very large one in Hong Kong. And what I realized was, because we, kind of rejected the liturgy because we looked like Hillsong, basically, like kind of really. But I suddenly realized,
I'll forgive you. It's okay.
I love it. No, but because we weren't encouraging our people to do confession and repentance as part of their daily life, when it came to talking about these issues, it was very hard to get people to realize there's some repentance to be done. So I want to encourage us, for those of us who are in the C of E, actually confession and repentance is very much part of our daily diet of spirituality. And that's why I actually have a cautious optimism for the Church of England to really lead the way of reconciliation and repentance in these things. So be encouraged, please.
Oh, that's really interesting. One of the things that Christina's message say that she can't join us, so we will end the session slightly earlier without her, but we're not going to lose you while we've got you. Anyone who knows me knows that a person is a resource, I keep them.
I'm absolutely happy if anyone else had any thoughts or...
We will. I'm encouraging people to put stuff into the chat, and there are some odd bits and pieces that I will definitely bring in. That's really important. One of the things that Christine was going to talk about was, and she will mention it separately in her own session, is that what these sessions can do for people is make them incredibly uncomfortable. And no one likes to be uncomfortable. So you've got options about what you do. You can be defensive about what's making you uncomfortable and shut it out and get rid of it. You can try and examine what's making you uncomfortable and get rid of it, or you can rest with the discomfort and try and work out how to make the environment better for everything, the thing that's making you uncomfortable and not. So I think what you're saying is really important, actually. It's not for us to go, this is all traumatic, it's terrible, it's too much of a weight to bear. It's what Remy says, what can we do in our own context, in the small steps that we can each take in relation to what's going on. So I've got a couple of comments in here I want to bring in. Let me have a little look and see. Eileen, do you want to just bring in the comment that you're making about reconciliation to follow on Mark is saying, because it's probably quite important to have you into this conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, in some ways, because some of the things that Mark had said, some of us who share the same heritage, we bury pretty deeply because they're really, really too heart-wrenching to live with. And to for someone like me that is immersing myself in a British community where such things are buried and passed and actually almost as if they didn't exist. You can't have reconciliation if there's no belief that reconciliation is necessary. What do you reconcile with if you think that, in fact, you've been pretty good and everything you've done is understandable and totally acceptable? There is nothing to confess or repent. And so the journey, and again, Mark talks about reconciliation, which is right. But then if Mark talks about reconciliation or I talk about reconciliation, it's as if we are the problem. Because we are the only ones who seem to point out that there is an issue. And if the history is not a shared history, because it is, whether we like it or not, those who did, those who were done to, we share that history. And then there needs to be acceptance that, that history isn't a history that doesn't grieve God's heart. It's a history that grieves God's heart. And so there needs to be reconciliation because God is the one that desires, that to be accepted totally and put right.
I guess one of the responses to that would be, Eileen, that you have commented in the chat that you find some of the episodes that Mark's talked about too painful to speak about. So if the people who are traumatized and oppressed aren't able to share or don't get a platform to share, Tim put into the comments he didn't even know anything about that period of history and what was going on and some of those stories. If you don't know what the history is that you're trying to address, or the pain, that the ripples and the effects of the pain of which you're trying to cope with in contemporary society, those people remain voiceless again. The trauma just keeps on continuing. So education, which is what we're trying to do here, being prepared to ask questions and listening to why the people are traumatized. Maybe Mark, sorry.
I think what might be interesting and perhaps something that some of us might not be aware of is that some of that trauma is what you might term it as internalized racism. And one of the ways that internalized racism manifests, particularly in people who are East Asian, so there's a term being bandied about more recently called proximity to whiteness, okay? So someone might look at me and go, for an ethnic minority, you have a closer proximity to whiteness than your black brother. They're just looking at skin tone, okay? And therefore, it's how should I go for it? Okay, so the internalized racism for people like myself means that I might start believing scripts such as "we are the model minority." Now, I want to address this term because the United States is a bit further ahead in terms of its thinking because they've had longer generations of migrants. But the model minority myth, it's a myth, says that if you're East Asian, and you guys don't seem to cause as much social mischief and crime. You guys work hard, you perform well in schools, you contribute to society well. You're a model minority. Why can't other minorities be like you? Now, the internalized racism can manifest in two ways. It could be me thinking, yeah, we've made it. God, why can't you blacks, get your stuff together? Okay. But actually, this is a myth because, again, it doesn't take into account that different groups have different opportunities. Like we know, looking at the data, that so many black children don't get the same privileges in terms of education and care and support. So to believe this model minority myth is actually to pit different groups against each other. And ultimately, and this is what the literature says, it forwards the white norm project. So, if you meet an East Asian and, you want to kind of befriend them, don't go so far as to compliment them as to say, you Japanese are really nice. We like you Japanese. You're not like the ones from, Somalia, because there's lots of drugs down in that part of town. That really, really isn't helpful. And it's falling into the trap of indexing, which is what the Enlightenment and rational thought brought in. And that's when we really deviated from the teaching of the Bible. So I think, that model minority myth is a huge area of discussion at the moment, actually. And it's good to be aware of it, not to compare groups. It really isn't fair, and it falls back into the categorizations that came from the White Project.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Alison in. Alison, would you just come in with the comment that you've said there, because it links to something also that was said later on by Andrew. So Alison?
Yes, I was just wondering, so much of what you said, Mark, was enlightening for me tonight. And I was thinking about also Eileen's presentations, which moved me greatly, about these traumas and these things from the past, which we are not aware of. I didn't know about the trenches, and a lot of Eileen's things that she mentioned to us, I had no idea. Now, how do we become aware of all this so that we can be more understanding and therefore encourage others to be more so as well? I find that quite a tricky question to think about.
If I could respond, again, to make it relevant to now, we have all these Hong Kongers coming over. But what's interesting, I looked at the national curriculum for home educating, and they don't cover the Opium Wars, where Britain basically smuggled in opium into China to get hundreds of thousands of people addicted so that then they would have to trade with the Brits. And that's how they got Hong Kong. So I think a lot of it comes in, in the education. And actually there's, for the Hong Kong thing, if you type in the BBC Opium Wars, they've actually got some really great resources that seek to bring this to the surface. But I think it just means, sadly, that we have to be proactive in searching this stuff out, because this stuff isn't taught in schools. You look at the Victorian era, and usually when we study it, we look at the niceties and the innovations that the Victorian era brought. But actually, in terms of British foreign policy, it's under Victoria's reign that arguably we probably did the most damage to other nations, interestingly. So, a good place to start might be going to your school and asking to see, well, what are you teaching the kids? Are you giving them a fully rounded history lesson or not?
Can I put a little warning on that, Mark, in relation to, I think we've got a lot of people in this space who are associated with schools, perhaps as governors or chairs of governors and things. And I'm not saying that there aren't valid questions to ask about this. There certainly are, but schools teach the national curriculum. What schools, so they are required to teach certain things in a certain way. What every school does have is a diversity and equalities policy. And anyone in this space can go along to their school and offer support in what does that policy look like? How is it realized in school? How can we ask some questions about supporting that? Other resources that you might be able to bring in? Can we help you with that constructively? Stomping into your local school and saying what you're teaching and why you're teaching that may not have the best impact.
Yes.
And I don't have to say this to a man with many children. I'm just making that point generally speaking. We've actually got I know you've recommended BBC and that's really helpful, but Andrew's got a specific question about resources. Andrew, can I ask you to come in with that one?
You're muted, Andrew. Can't hear you, mate.
Apologize. Yeah, about the comment, you make me feel there's actually there are some bits of history that I don't really know about. That might be written from a different point of view, from a sort of economically dominant Victoria, morally self-righteous point of view. And actually, I'm very much open to suggestions about, or can we read some history, and what should we read that will give us a different perspective.
Yeah.
Can you make some solid suggestions, Mark, for some stuff that might be useful to people to read? I mean, not necessarily now, but we could, if there was a general reading list that you thought might be helpful, we could certainly bring that in.
Be very happy to send a couple of resources or websites. Again, because, we're not the only people asking this question. There are other groups and churches asking it. And actually, there's some great people and organizations seeking to just help inform us a bit. And I think this comes down to, do we just swallow the narratives of the age around us? I think obviously, at least when I read the Gospels and the Epistles, it encourages us to think twice about what we're swallowing, what we're taking in, basically.
Yeah, there's a really interesting religious studies podcast on the formation of Buddhism on Japan as it was defined by the Dutch and by the British, because Japan was an isolated island. It didn't understand or have to express its own set of beliefs. And the Dutch rocked up and they wanted to trade with them. So they basically said, you're this and we're that, and that means you've got to change. And so the Japanese were forced into a situation where they had to form their Buddhism in the face of this kind of oppression, which then became Japanese Buddhism. But but it was formed in that kind of oppressive, isolated place. I just want to bring Sarah in. Sarah, would you bring in your comment, please? Because we've been talking about language, and language is quite important as well in previous sessions. Mark, are you okay taking the weight of all this while Christine's not here? Because I did think we'd finish early, but we're not.
No, any time for us to chat and learn. I'm learning as well.
Yeah, me too. Loads. Okay, Sarah.
Okay then, so mine was just really, because I'm becoming hopefully a little bit more aware, and it was just about the use of the terms Black and minority ethnic, so particularly as BAME, and other related shorthand that's knocking around at the moment fairly regularly. In the context of what you were telling us about the White Norm Project and indexing, having heard more frequently, perhaps more regularly, that a lot of people find even just Black and minority ethnic just way too big a group of people to be put into. And I was very interested about your responses to the East Asian description as well.
Yeah, Eileen, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Okay, thanks. BAME highlights color because it starts as Black, and then it also reinforces something that's actually it's actually an error. So it's Black, Asian, and because the label Asian is created in this country, perhaps for this purpose of BAME, labeling, is actually disenfranchising those of us who are Asians, but not the Asians that have been conceived, by the British government. And so, in fact, it's reinforcing an error, and it's reinforcing that there's an issue with people who are Black. In particular, there's a highlighting of that. And then thirdly, it's lumping then everyone else as minority ethnic. So there's a kind of a scale going on there.
Yeah, and I think this highlights the complexity of language, but it still doesn't kind of answer the question, well, what do we say then? What do
Well,
we do?
I mean, at the moment for the diocese, when Remy was handing over the baton of the advisor role to me, I mentioned to the bishop that for the time being, because our context is the UK, I'm happier to say UK minority ethnics, because then everyone, who has an experience of racism or cultural misidentity or whatever, that we're not, there's no scale, it's not all about color, and so on and so on. So that's what we're temporarily doing. Some people have talked about global majority. I'm actually not comfortable with that. It's bad enough having been called a minority, but to then have something that says, that sounds like, even it might not be, because it's a truth, a chip on the shoulder. Oh, okay, so you want to be called a majority, so therefore you label yourself global majority. We don't need that kind of silliness going on.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what's interesting, I alluded to the fact that in America, they've had a longer history of immigration, I think, in terms of at least the East Asians, because of the railroads. And what I was talking to the Asian American Center of Theological Studies, and the dean there said, actually, Mark, we've spent the last 50 years still trying to nail the vocabulary. And so the reason why, Sarah, and I love that you brought up this question, the reason that we struggle and we stutter a bit is because there probably isn't the vocabulary out there for people in a minority to articulate their experience. The language doesn't exist yet. And if you can't articulate your lived experience, then it's very difficult to communicate it to people who are not, of your ethnic group. So I still think that the academy, the academics, the theologians and scholars are actually still formulating the languages. And to do that well, I think that's why I said we need to have a really good imagination, right? We need to think, what's the kingdom vision? What's the kingdom goal? And allow our theology of that to inform the vocabulary that we come up with to describe our existence. Otherwise, we'll just defer to the vocabulary that's coming out of the world, which could possibly be more damaging. But that's a great question, Sarah. Thank you.
Can I just chip in about, because going back to what Alison was asking, if the trauma is so deep in all the different minority ethnic peoples, and therefore, you don't speak much of it, and also the history books are all, particularly selected to raise up the people, the stereotype, the existing situation, and hiding a lot of reality. What do we do? Well, we do have the Church of England's task force, anti-racism task force, that is presenting a report that then goes towards the commission that we set up on what to focus on that would make a difference. So very practical things. And one of the things that I hope that they will respond with is what addresses what you've been asking, Alison, which is, what do we do about the literature, the history books, what's in the education domain, that is so partial both in the bias sense and partial both in the missing a lot of information sense.
And I think, we're talking about big issues, but again, I definitely would like it to be more, for us, to be more practical minded. And, I mentioned the whole model minority myth earlier on, but a word I'd like to leave you with as well is the word leverage. How do you as an individual leverage the privilege that you've got? So as someone who's Chinese, I have certain privileges that some of my Southeast Asian friends don't have, who have certain privileges that some of my friends from Africa don't have. And you will probably have certain privileges that you have that I don't have, or Eileen has, or whatever. And I think a good place to start is by saying, how can I leverage my my privilege? Because again, we are one body in Christ, and this whole issue of race and this I mentioned this space of tension. This is a concern for all of us, actually, because the body will not be whole and together until we all work in it. As I said, together, I mentioned the thing about the hiddenness. You see things in me that I don't see and vice versa. How can you leverage your circles of influence, even your position or the powers that you have, to lift up the other? And again, I just then think of a teaching of Jesus, who was the servant. How do we lift up others who are different from ourselves in a practical sense?
And I think perhaps that's a really good time to draw this together. I mean, if anyone is feeling overwhelmed by what they've been hearing or what they've heard and suddenly feel they need to go and read every history book on the nation for every individual minority group or majority group in the country, it ain't going to work. But what you can do is think about when you walk out of your front door, who do you meet and how do you listen to them? How do you raise them up? How do they become brother or sister? I think that's a really practical way of spending the next week before we meet again.
If I could just add one, a couple of practical points on that, then just in the same thing. But I'm in my diocese, I'm being a bit cheeky. So in Bristol, just to share with you what's happening down in Bristol, we had a new bishop, Bishop Viv, who's amazing, and she's been in post for about a year and a half now, and we're going through something called Transforming Church. So for the next few years, our diocese are on a listening exercise, listening to the voices of those who aren't normally heard. And one of the things I'm putting forward is it would be great on PCCs if diversity was almost like a standing agenda point. So in the same way that safeguarding is, or maybe eco churches or whatever it is, would it be so bad if diversity was a standing point? You could appoint someone who would always make sure that it's on there. And I appreciate PCC meetings are already chock-a-block, but I would say what's 5 minutes compared to 500 years of getting it wrong? And also, often in seminars like this, we're preaching to the converted. Okay, it's the people not in this room who really we want to be part of this conversation. But making sure that diversity is on your PCC means other leaders have to engage with it, and it filters down. And it's true, since safeguarding has become a mandatory topic on PCCs, I would generally say that congregations are much better at it, at spotting it, knowing it. So that's perhaps one, I think, really powerful practical way that you could get this on the agenda in your church.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really important point. And actually, that's one that when Remy went round visiting various deaneries, that was one of the things that he suggested. So I think that's really helpful. Yeah, that's lovely. Marvellous. Right, well, I am going to give you Christine's deep apologies for not being able to join us. I think it's a real shame because she had lots to offer. But actually, Mark, I think there was a lot to discuss today. So it has been time very well spent. I apologise to everyone for our strange internet problems and connections, and I will find out by next week how to turn that ding dong off because it's driving me demented. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody for their kindness, for their listening, for their welcome and humility in the conversations we've been having. Remy, can I hand over to you?
Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Mark for that insightful talk that you gave us. I mean, lots has been covered, and it would be a great opportunity as time goes on to explore those at some point. I mean, I was hearing, for example, right from the beginning, issues around government policy, and immigration, and we've seen a lot of that, over the past year. People, sitting here today have been really graceful as, he spoke about things. What came across to me was that word, white fragility, which a lot of research has gone about that. And in terms of how that can link with unconscious bias, but also in terms of our structures and our systems. So in terms of structures and systems, we see a lot of disproportionately, people who are disproportionately represented in the health system, things to do with jobs, and even in the criminal justice system. So what Mark was highlighting goes right through the various structures. And then we come to language. And yes, it's highlighted about the history of America. And I also get the point where many have written about language can be very much about people still searching for some kind of acceptance or identity or whatever we may wish to call it. But a very key thing I want to highlight is that in order to learn, there are times we have to unlearn. And yes, we may have had or learned something many years ago. We're welcome to unlearn that, and that brings they've grown up with, to know that they can either feel they're more, or that one color overrides another color, you know, and we've got to really start thinking about the diet that we feed our children. That's the emotional diet that we're talking about here. A key topic here was also trauma. Trauma is carried. Mark spoke about how he had to hide, you know, he had to almost hide his culture. We hide emotionally. People tell me I'm invisible. People become invisible, not because they're not seen, it's just that they don't belong. They don't have a voice. And so all that we've heard today is very much alive in our society. And then we'll come back to the same question, what can we do about it? The beauty about today is we are learning, we are informed, and we've got a strong basis to speak to those people who basically live out of ignorance, because that's what it is. Sometimes that becomes an excuse, and we use a lot of excuses in our lives, in our churches, in our systems, because we do not want to confront the truth. And so one of the things I would encourage us as we go back to our, you know, parishes, etc., to really think about, what does truth actually mean? I made a point in the chat room that in a lot of research that has happened, the ideal has been defined by how a lot of people in power feel it is. So if I say something, for example, it doesn't matter because I am Black. I walk around in Durham, the first thing people ask me is, are you a student? In other words, their baseline, there's nothing wrong with being a student, but I wonder, why ask me that? And so I begin to see there's a baseline that I'm not good enough to be anything other than a student. That's a real life example. So we've shared, we've got painful stories, but we need to rest. But as we go away to rest, let us see how we can become representative signs of God's presence in a world, in this world, in our world, so that God's kingdom can be made much more alive where we are. And for those who've managed to do session 1 of the course, the ponder point was actually translating faith into action. What does translating the Christian faith as revealed in the person of Christ mean to you today in terms of addressing racism and all forms of inequality? I will pause there, but thank you very much. And I don't know if we have the prayer on the screen, Karenza, but I will now close with the prayer. I will read it out and just allow yourselves to take it in. And it's a prayer for peace and justice. Grant us, Lord, a vision of your world as you would have it. A world where peace is built with justice and where justice is guided by love. May we know your compassion for all who suffer and your courage in challenging complacency. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And we look forward to meeting you all next week, where Gavin, who is the coordinating chaplain at Durham University, will be with us. But we'll also have another special guest, who is Rabbi Aaron, who will also be with us. And the focus for next week will be around anti-Semitism. And I'm sure that will be an excellent conversation. And we will let you know when Christine can join us. But until then, every blessing to you all, and thank you. Bye.
And thanks for having me from Bristol.
You're welcome.